On the morning of June 7, 1944, a German panzer officer crouched behind a Norman hedgerow and watched a column of American Sherman tanks roll past a burning farmhouse 200 meters away. He had fought in Russia. He had survived Kursk. He knew tanks. And what he saw did not frighten him, not at first. His unit had already destroyed 4 of these machines that morning. The crews who got out were running. The ones who didn't were still inside. The Sherman burned fast. His men had a name for it already, borrowed from the British who had been fighting it longer. They called it the Tommy Cooker. Later, after the Americans adopted a famous cigarette lighter brand as their own grim nickname for it, they would call it the Ronson, after the advertising slogan that promised it would light first every time. He was not afraid of the Sherman. Not yet. Within 8 months, his entire army would be walking away from their own vehicles. Tigers, Panthers, King Tigers, abandoned on roadsides, out of fuel, out of parts, out of everything. And the Shermans would still be rolling east. If you want to understand how that happened, how a tank that German crews openly mocked in 1942 became part of the system that crushed the Wehrmacht by 1945, stay with this story, and make sure you're subscribed before we go any further. To understand why the Germans laughed first, you have to go back to what American armor actually looked like before the war, and what American military thinkers believed a tank was fundamentally for. In 1940, the United States Army possessed fewer than 300 modern tanks. Germany had rolled into France that spring with over 2,700 armored vehicles. American doctrine, shaped by the experience of the First World War, treated the tank primarily as an infantry support weapon, a machine for helping foot soldiers cross open ground and silence enemy positions. The concept of independent armored thrusts, the deep operational strikes that Germany called blitzkrieg, existed in American theoretical writing but had not transformed into procurement decisions or field doctrine. The M3 Lee, America's primary tank when it first met German armor in North Africa in the spring of 1942, illustrated the problem in physical form. Its main 75mm gun was mounted not in a rotating turret but in a fixed hull sponson. To bring it to bear on a target, the entire tank had to pivot. British crews who received the Lee under Lend-Lease described the design charitably as having a hull-down problem. It could not use the most basic survival tactic available to armored vehicles. German crews who encountered it described it less charitably. The M4 Sherman, which entered service in large numbers by late 1942, was genuinely better. Its 75mm gun sat in a fully rotating turret. It was mechanically reliable in a way that German tanks, for all their engineering ambition, frequently were not. The Panzer IV broke down regularly. The Tiger, which appeared in Tunisia in late 1942, consumed enormous maintenance resources and could travel only short distances under its own power before requiring service. The Panther, Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, was plagued by transmission failures throughout much of its operational life. German armored divisions moving to contact could expect to lose a substantial fraction of their strength to mechanical failure before they encountered an enemy. The Sherman was built on American industrial logic, standardized parts, ease of maintenance, reliability under field conditions. Its 4 GAA engine produced 500 horsepower and proved durable in ways German power plants envied. American mechanics could replace a Sherman engine in the field in approximately 4 hours. Replacing a Tiger's engine required specialized equipment and trained workshop crews and could consume the better part of a day under ideal conditions. But durability and ease of maintenance were not the qualities German tankers evaluated when they examined the Sherman's gun and armor. And what they found there gave them every rational basis for contempt. The Sherman's frontal armor measured approximately 81mm on early production models. The German long-barreled 75mm gun on the Panzer IV could penetrate it at ranges approaching 1,000 meters. The 88mm gun in the Tiger could destroy a Sherman at over 2,000 meters, well beyond any range at which the Sherman's own gun threatened the Tiger's frontal armor. German tankers who had survived the savage armor battles of the Eastern Front looked at the Sherman and saw something manageable. It was not the Soviet T-34, which had sloped armor and a gun capable of penetrating most German tanks at combat ranges. The Sherman's armor was vertical, its gun undersized against the heavier German machines appearing in increasing numbers. At Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, the verdict came in hard and fast. German armor under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel drove through American positions with a confidence that the results entirely justified. American tank crews were inexperienced, their tactical coordination poor, and their machines outgunned by the weapons they faced. The after-action reports reaching Washington were blunt about the exchange ratios. German crews were not. The official German assessment circulated among Panzer officers in the months that followed described American armor as zahlreich aber minderwertig, numerous but inferior. The word carried a specific sharpness in German military culture. Not merely weaker, of lesser worth. One captured German tank officer, interviewed by American intelligence in the summer of 1943, described his unit's reaction to Shermans in numbers with a dismissiveness that bordered on professional contempt. They were not afraid of them, he said. They were concerned about running out of ammunition. This assessment was accurate as far as it went. What it missed was the assumption embedded within it, that the equation would remain stable, that American industry would not find answers, that American doctrine would not adapt, that the weight of American production would not eventually create tactical realities that no German engineering solution could counter. All three assumptions were wrong. If you're watching this for the first time, this channel is dedicated to exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that reveal what the history books summarize in a single sentence. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. The response to Kasserine came not primarily from ordnance officers designing better tanks, though that work was underway. It came first from doctrine and organization. General Leslie McNair, who oversaw the development and training of Army ground forces, pushed for systematic analysis of every engagement in Tunisia, feeding lessons back into training with a speed the Wehrmacht's increasingly rigid command culture could not match. The most significant doctrinal conclusion was counterintuitive given what Kasserine's headlines had suggested. American tanks, McNair and his colleagues argued, should not be used primarily to fight enemy tanks. That was the job of dedicated tank destroyer battalions, the M10, the M18 Hellcat, and later the M36, fielding progressively more powerful anti-tank guns on mobile platforms that could be attached to divisions as needed. Sherman tanks should do what they had originally been designed for, supporting infantry, exploiting breakthroughs, destroying supply lines and artillery parks, operating at operational depth rather than slugging it out frontally with Tigers. This doctrine was controversial and its limitations would become apparent in the Bocage country of Normandy, where tank destroyers were not always available when Sherman crews needed them most. But it reflected a genuine strategic insight that American armor's real advantage lay not in winning individual tank duels, which Germany would win on technical terms for most of the war, but in mass, mobility, and integration with other arms operating within a logistical system of overwhelming capacity. Simultaneously, production figures were building toward numbers that German intelligence analysts found literally unbelievable. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 49,500 Sherman tanks in all variants. Germany produced approximately 8,850 Panthers and approximately 1,347 Tigers of all marks combined. Total German tank production for the entire war across all types was roughly 46,000 vehicles, fewer than the Sherman alone. The Detroit arsenal was producing Sherman tanks at a tempo where losses that would have crippled a German armored division could be replaced within weeks. A Sherman destroyed on a Tuesday in the Bocage might be replaced by a new vehicle from the supply depot by Friday. The dead crew members could not be replaced so easily. That arithmetic was brutal and the men doing the dying understood it clearly, but the machines themselves were effectively inexhaustible from the German perspective. German armored commanders operated inside a different mathematics entirely. A Tiger lost was a Tiger lost. By the autumn of 1944, panzer divisions that existed on paper with complements of over 100 tanks were frequently fielding 20 or 30 operational vehicles after accounting for mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and combat losses. The Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's finest armored formations, entered Normandy in June of 1944 with over 200 tanks and assault guns. By the time of Operation Cobra in late July, it had been reduced to fewer than 40 operational vehicles. The Normandy campaign initially seemed to confirm German technical confidence. In the close Bocage country, with its ancient hedgerows rising 8 feet above sunken lanes, American armor was channeled into corridors where German anti-tank guns and the occasional Tiger could engage Shermans at point-blank range. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger I of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion at Villers-Bocage on June 13, destroyed approximately 13 Sherman tanks in a single engagement that German propaganda turned into confirmation of everything their tankers had believed since Kasserine. Reports of the action circulated through German armored units in Normandy and reinforced the conviction that qualitative superiority could compensate for quantitative disadvantage. Wittmann was killed on August 8 near Saint-Aignan-de-Kremsnil, almost certainly by a Firefly Sherman firing a 17-pounder round from a hull-down position at approximately 800 meters. His Tiger's side armor had not saved him. The most celebrated German tank commander on the Western Front had been killed by the weapon his commanders had classified as inferior. But the more consequential story of Normandy was not individual duels. It was the grinding, systemic destruction of German armored strength through compounding disadvantages that German command could not address simultaneously. American and British artillery relentlessly attacked German assembly areas, supply depots, and maintenance facilities. Allied fighter bombers, the Jabo that German soldiers feared with a visceral intensity, turned every daylight movement by German armor into a potentially fatal exercise. A German armored division shifting sectors had to move at night, slowly, over bombed roads, with fuel that might not arrive. An American armored division making the same move traveled by day on roads protected by its own air cover, refueling along the route, arriving with full ammunition loads. Operation Cobra at the end of July 1944 shattered the Panzer Lehr Division under a combined aerial and artillery bombardment that its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, described in his post-war memoirs with the stunned language of a man still processing what he had experienced. His forward positions, he wrote, looked like the face of the moon. At least 70% of his troops were out of action, dead, wounded, or, in his word, crazed. Several men had run into the open and been cut down by shell fragments. The shock effect, he said, was indescribable. Through the gap Cobra tore open, Patton's Third Army poured into open country and began moving at speeds that paralyzed German attempts to establish new defensive lines. Shermans were covering 50, 60, 70 miles a day, not because they could outfight German tanks in individual engagements, but because they moved faster, required less maintenance, and were supported by a logistical infrastructure that kept them moving while German units sat stranded by empty fuel tanks. The Red Ball Express, the emergency trucking operation improvised by American logisticians, ran approximately 5,500 trucks continuously between the Normandy beaches and the front, delivering approximately 12,500 tons of supplies per day at its peak. A substantial proportion of its drivers were African-American soldiers from transportation battalions, men that the segregated army had largely excluded from combat roles but whose contribution to the campaign's operational tempo was as decisive as any armored thrust. German supply officers examining captured American logistical records reported figures to their superiors that were received with open disbelief. The daily consumption of a single American armored division exceeded what many German corps received in a week. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, had written before the war that tanks should be used in mass to achieve decision through shock and speed rather than attrition. The bitter irony of the summer of 1944 was that it was the Americans, in their inferior Shermans, who were practicing something close to Guderian's own doctrine, while the Germans, with their superior Tigers and Panthers, were using their armor in static defensive lines until it was bypassed and destroyed. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 brought the two systems into their final decisive confrontation on the Western Front, and it did so on terms that exposed every assumption the 1943 German assessment had rested upon. The German plan rested on expectations about American behavior that had been accurate at Kasserine Pass but were no longer accurate 22 months later. German planners expected American units to break under the shock of a sudden large-scale offensive. They expected to capture American fuel dumps quickly enough to solve the critical shortage that was, by December of 1944, the single greatest constraint on German operations. The lead element of the 6th SS Panzer Army, Kampfgruppe, was equipped with approximately 80 King Tiger tanks, machines whose frontal armor reached 185 mm and whose long 88 mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Against the King Tiger's frontal armor, the American 76 mm gun was essentially ineffective at standard combat ranges. Paper drove deep into the American rear on the offensive's first days. His column came within reach of a fuel dump at Stavelot containing approximately 2 million gallons of gasoline, enough to sustain the offensive for weeks. American defenders destroyed the bridge over the Amblev River before he could capture it. They were not breaking and running as Kasserine veterans had done. They were executing a deliberate denial operation, burning what they could not hold, making every kilometer cost the German advance in time and irreplaceable fuel. Paper's column ran dry. The King Tigers, the most formidable individual tank Germany had deployed on the Western Front, stopped where they stood, not destroyed by American fire but simply out of fuel. By December 23, Paper ordered his men to abandon their vehicles and escape on foot through the forest. The most powerful German armored force committed to the offensive had been defeated not by a superior tank but by a superior system, the logistics network that had protected its fuel, the communications that had coordinated the defense, the artillery that had blocked the roads, the infantry that had held long enough for the counterattack to organize. That counterattack came from Patton's Third Army, which reoriented 3 full corps, approximately 250,000 men and their equipment, through 90 degrees in approximately 72 hours in winter conditions, over roads clogged with retreating units. German commanders who received the intelligence report dismissed it as impossible. The 4th Armored Division, leading the relief column north toward Bastogne, drove through terrain German staffs had assessed as impassable for armored operations in winter. The Shermans moved anyway. Fuel arrived. Ammunition arrived. Maintenance crews kept the vehicles running. The division reached the Bastogne perimeter on the evening of December 26. The German tankers who stood in their way fought with genuine skill and courage. Several Tiger crews recorded individual kill tallies during the bulge that would have earned Berlin dispatches in any earlier year. What they could not do was make those individual victories add up to operational success when the system behind them was collapsing in every dimension simultaneously. By March of 1945, the Rhine had been crossed at Remagen, where the Ludendorff Railway Bridge fell intact into American hands on March 7 before German engineers could complete its demolition. American armor was across the river within 24 hours. The barrier German propaganda had called unbreakable crossed in a single day. Army Group B, trapped in the Ruhr encirclement that followed, surrendered approximately 330,000 men. Field Marshal Walter Model, whom Hitler had dispatched to stabilize every crisis the war had produced, walked into a forest near Duisburg on April 21 and shot himself. He could not find a professional solution to what American armor had become, and he could not face that fact any other way. The images that photographers recorded in the final weeks of the war told the story without requiring narration. Road after road through the German heartland lined with abandoned armored vehicles. Tigers, Panthers, King Tigers, not destroyed by American fire but simply stopped where they had run out of fuel, or where their engines had finally failed without replacement parts, or where their crews had concluded there was nothing left worth dying for. The Shermans drove past them, fueled, armed, crewed by men with orders and the means to execute them. The Tommy Cookers rolling east through the wreckage of the finest armored force the European continent had produced. The German tankers who survived the war and lived to write their memoirs returned repeatedly to a particular moment of recognition, the moment which came at different times for different men, when they understood that 1943's technical confidence had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. They had been comparing gun penetration figures and armor specifications, the quantifiable parameters their engineering tradition told them were the meaningful variables. The Americans had been building something those specifications could not capture, a system greater than the sum of its tanks. The Sherman's gun could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at standard combat ranges. That remained true on the last day of the war in Europe as it had been on the first day American armor met German armor in North Africa. In that narrow, technical sense, the men who called it numerous but inferior in 1943 had not been wrong. What they had been wrong about was everything else. A weapon is not defined only by its individual specifications. It is defined by the system it operates within, the logistics that fuel and arm it, the doctrine that employs it, the industrial base that replaces it, the organizational culture that learns from its failures faster than the enemy can exploit them. Measured against all of those criteria, the Sherman was not an inferior weapon. It was the instrument of a superior system, fighting a kind of war the Tiger had never been designed to survive. The last German tanker to laugh at a Sherman did so somewhere in North Africa or Italy in 1943. By Normandy, none of them were laughing. By the Rhine, They were walking away from their own vehicles and watching the Shermans drive past. The guns on those Shermans had not fundamentally changed since Kasserine. The system behind them had become something the Wehrmacht could not outlast, could not outmaneuver, and in the end could not understand until it was far too late. If the story changed how you think about what actually wins wars, share it with someone who'd find it just as compelling, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. This community spans the globe, and every one of you is part of keeping these stories alive.